Hi and welcome back to the History Up. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K, and we're continuing our discussion of the Act of Union. So we've talked about sort of the lead up to it, put a bit of context around it. So there is a union in the 1650s under Cromwell?
There is. It's not the one we're talking about, but there is actually one, yes. So still a little bit to go. Yeah, so Cromwell takes on the job of protector of the Commonwealth. So now England and Scotland are called the Commonwealth and are the protectorate, and he's the kind of head of it. And of course, it's not a problem while he lives, but the question is exactly the same as it is for kings. What do you do when Cromwell dies? Like, who's going to take over then? So they've already got rid of the king. Is it just going to be like some guy off the street, or what's it going to be? So what Cromwell does, though, and I just mentioned this briefly, is forces a union of England and Scotland. So the English don't get any opportunity to argue, the Scots don't, and he puts troops in Scotland, and the Scots, and this is just typical though, the Scots have to pay for the pleasure of having an occupying force in their midst. That's normal. And the only other thing I think that people quite often mention is that he imposes quite a harsh taxation plan on Scotland. And of course you know what it's like with taxes. As soon as somebody works out a good way to tax people, it hardly ever goes away, even when there's a new face on the block. So Cromwell dies in I think 1659, and briefly his son Richard Dickie Cromwell comes to power, and it's kind of clear. I mean, by the time Cromwell dies, I believe he's walking around in king's clothing, the ermine and stuff. Yeah. And I think it's clear that people who are powerful, the elite, are kind of like, I wonder what we're going to do next. Maybe we should find out what young Charles is up to. So there's a group of the political elite send off to Charles and say to him, would you come back and be king? And the Scots had already declared him king in, I said 1614, it was really 1651, and he'd been forced back out into France, but he's really unsure because his father was killed by them. He's like, well, I don't know. And if you look back to Mary Queen of Scots, she's in Ireland as well. So he's and the other thing is that when Cromwell was in power and before his father was killed, and I always think this is heartbreakingly wonderful, he wrote what's called a carte blanche, which to you would be a blank piece of paper. So, blank piece of paper, lovely paper though, really nice royal paper.
High-end
none
stuff.
of your, Basel and Bond, none of your rubbish. And signed it at the bottom and said to them, put in anything you want, just don't kill my father. Just ask us for anything at all, but just don't kill him. Of course they ignore him, so he's kind of ticked about that too. And he's been all over the place, he's been fighting all over the place. But, so he's unsure. And so they come to a deal, this is called the Declaration of Breda, because that's the town that they're in at the time. And he returns in 1660, and they give him, a certain amount of money, and there are, a few more rules than perhaps there were before. And he promises that he'll pardon all the people that were involved in, all this stuff. But I think a year after he gets back, he digs up the bodies of, Cromwell's one of the people and does nasty things to them, but that could just be a made-up story. So he does come back. He returns in 1660, and there's a huge procession for him in London, and people are out. And I think this is this great piece of historical trivia. It was the first time that you could buy a coronation mug. So a coronation souvenir was for the 60s. You know how you can get them like the Prince Charles mug when he becomes King Charles, and that will be an issue. What number is he going to be? Yeah. So Charles the First, and so what number will he be? If he was called James, it would really be a big problem. So so this is called the Restoration. Everything settles down. It's a wonderful time. The Puritans have been in power for a while. They shut down all the cafes and all the nightclubs and the theatres and all the fun stuff, the gaming places. So he reopens everything. He's a great patron of the arts, a fabulous guy. And he has lots and lots of girlfriends as well. Nell Gwyn Moll Flanders. I think he's got 13 illegitimate children. So he's a busy, busy boy. So everything kind of settles down in England. There are still religious disturbances in Scotland with a group of men who had signed a national covenant to protect the real faith, and so they're called the Covenanters, and so they're quite powerful. And he had said that he would forgive them as well, but he doesn't really, when he comes back. So the Restoration period is, well, first of all, it's a great period for Scottish agriculture and the Scottish economy, and I'll just mention that in a minute. But the problem that it still leaves is this problem that's always there, the problem of succession, because he does have all these illegitimate children, but no heir with his actual wife, and so that's a problem. And his oldest son, I believe when it was during the Civil War, he has an affair with his governess, and then he has, in this period, he has his first son, and he calls him James, but his title is the Duke of Monmouth, and the Duke of Monmouth, as he grows up, comes to feel that he should really be the heir to the throne, and Charles is like, no, it has to go through the correct bloodline, so we do everything properly, I'm the king, we do everything properly. So that's going to be a real issue. But if you were looking at Scotland during the Restoration, it's a really good period for the Scots merchants in particular. Lots and lots of merchant activity. The big problem for the Scots is, of course, that they're shut out of English overseas markets. And in fact, Cromwell, when he found people trading illegally with the States, had them, sent away, sent into exile. So there's actually a lot of Scots on the east coast of America because of this, and there will be more afterwards. And by the time you get to the 1690s, it's fabulous because you have the guy that's kind of in charge of making sure there's no illegal activities, Edward Randolph. He's so absolutely upset because whenever they catch the Scots illegally bringing stuff in and he brings them to trial, the Scots on the jury let them off, and so they actually pass a ruling in the 1690s saying that only plantation-born men and Scots, no, not Scots, plantation-born men, the English, the Welsh, and the Irish can sit on juries because they're just sick and tired of all these Scots kind of getting away with murder, really. So. Lots of Scots on the East Coast, so they've got friends and relatives, and you have lots of scientific farming, so they're really working on liming land, making it more productive, the interesting thing about this period, the Restoration, so 1660 to 1685, is really that it's all tied up with what historians will later say about the Act of Union in 1707, because what they'll argue is that you've had a Scots economy that's been in a state of terminal decline and it's on the edge of collapse by the time you get to 1705, 1700. But if you actually look at what's going on in the Scottish economy from 1660 on, it's super active. Like there's tons of stuff going on, so I find it really difficult to kind of accept that argument. So there are some problems right before the Act of Union. I'll just kind of move along towards that just now in terms of economics, because the argument always is that it's an economic necessity for Scotland. So if it's an economic necessity, then there should be almost total collapse. And there is a problem right before the Act of Union. In the 1690s, it's a particularly bad time. It's called the 7 Ill Years, or King William's years. But it doesn't just affect Scotland, it affects all of Northern Europe. So it's a series of harvest failures. And in that short-term period, there are all sorts of terrible problems. The Scots, of course, caught off guard at first, are still exporting grain while people are starving in the country. But you see that with Ireland and the potato famine as well. And the estimates are that about 5% of the population died, and there were catastrophic stock losses. So if you lose all your cattle, not only are you losing food to eat, but you're losing all the fertilizer and all that other stuff. So there are short-term problems, but if you look at it from a longer perspective, it's actually things are actually going really well. So how would you tell that? If you were looking 1660 to 1707, how could you tell that things were going well? There are lots of parliamentary acts for improvements to agriculture, including an Enclosure Act, which is really important in 1661. People would enclose their land for tax breaks. There's government support for grain exports, and again, liming the land, improving the land's productivity. There's government encouragement for large-scale cattle rearing, and of course the cattle goes on the hoof down to the English market, so it goes through Carlisle and down to London, and there's tons of it moving down there. And because of that, they also in the late 1660s pass a Roads Act to improve the condition of the roads, because the roads are actually just a track that's wide enough for 2 cows, right? So a slight improvement to that. The rise in cattle trade, the cattle trade brought specific things called market fairs and periodic fairs. And the trade is so vibrant that there's actually an English act halting the cattle trade for a few months each year. So the English are like, wait, back off, you know, you're flooding us with stuff. So that means you've got an English Parliament saying, well, we're going to legislate for what suits us best, and you've got a Scottish Parliament legislate, so under the same crown. So you can see this is a bit of a problem. But still, 40% of Scots exports was in cattle to England in that, even in that really difficult time, the 1690s to about 1703. There's lots of publications of scientific agricultural societies giving practical guides to farming. They usually just call it scientific farming. And even patterns of landholding changed. There's a move to a thing called a single tenancy, and that meant that one person could stay on the one piece of land for an extended period of time, and so you get lots of innovations because you're going back again and again to that land. More land put under fallow, the introduction of new grasses. So everywhere you look, there's like really good activity going on. And one of the ways that you can, just in the way that these days you would say, you'd look at the housing market to see how well things are going. So in those days, economic vitality was best seen in the rise of market centres, and you needed a license to have a market. So if I just give you this one statistic, even though you and I aren't very good at math, this should work. From 1550 to 1660, 110 years, there were 143 licenses handed out to hold these fairs. From 1660 to 1707, short period, half of that, 346 new licenses handed out. So you had to have the license in order to hold the fair in the market centre. So it shows that, you know, lots of action. Scotland also followed the lead of, I think it's Sweden rather than say Europe, with the introduction of a banking system. The Bank of England was created by William Patterson and others, and he's a Scot, in 1694, and the Bank of Scotland created by the same guy and another group of people in 1695. So you've got the first bank. I think the Bank of Sweden was 1660, so it's the beginning of a new kind of system. And the bank had what we call limited liability, and it was tax exempt for 21 years, which is something you would give to like merchant companies, so it's really good. And it had branches. It wasn't like a bank today where you put money in, you could take money out. They would loan to companies and people like that. But it had a brief liquidity crisis in 1699 for about 7 or 8 years, but then it paid out annual dividends of 14%. Now my bank, I believe, pays out 1%, so if it pays out anything at all, shout out to the TD. So over the next 10 years, the average payout was 22% on average, so no problem there either. And Scots merchants were doing really well until the 1670s. It had been very difficult to become a merchant. This is another thing we forget. So you always have to like remember all sorts of things. You couldn't just go like you. I think I'll trade woolen goods somewhere. You know, I think I think I want to sell garbanzo beans, and we'd all say, what's a garbanzo bean? Where did you get that from? Have you been traveling again? Are you an explorer? But you couldn't just become a merchant. It was like a closed shop. You either had to be born into a family of merchants, or you had to marry into it, or when you married into it, it was a 7-year apprenticeship, so it took a really long time to become a merchant, so you couldn't just kind of pop up, like one of these pop-up stores. And because they wanted more merchants, because of this economic vitality, the apprenticeship time was reduced to about 3 years, and about 2/3 of them were recruited from outside the merchant family. So there is an attempt then to broaden this scope, and at the very most, there was about 20% involved in overseas trade, and that's the highest risk of all, because you have to get the ship and the cargo and there's shipwrecks and captains run off with your stuff and there's all sorts of problems. So failure loomed often for them, but it's only 20%. The other 80% are just doing regular merchant stuff. They probably have a fair turnover. And the great thing about merchants, Tom Devine pointed out, was that they reinvested their profits. They also did things like, as soon as you want, and I think this is probably true in all of Europe, as soon as you became a merchant, you wanted to be like a member of the landed gentry. So you would like buy yourself a little agricultural estate and set yourself up as kind of a gentleman farmer. But it looks as though they they bought up agricultural estates, but they improved them, made them more productive, and then they plowed the rest of the money back into the the rum distillery or the factory that they were involved in. And so so there's 2/3 of the new manufactories or ventures were set up between 1660 and 1710, which again, shows that there's nothing wrong with the economy. Now, in the 1970s, when there was a debate about whether Scotland should be independent or not, everybody dragged this old chestnut out about, oh, the economy will collapse and you'll all be left starving and you'll have to beg to get back in. And we've seen a bit of this fear-mongering in the recent campaign in 2014, as well as David Cameron saying to everybody that he knows in Britain on the telly, if any of you have relatives in Scotland, tweet them, call them, visit them, tell them don't go, but if you go, your economy's probably going to collapse, that, don't you? So it's the same argument, and that's why it's important to know about the first time it happened. So the first time it happened, when it's obviously the economy's doing well, everybody still went, oh, well, the economy was on the verge of collapse. So if you looked at Glasgow, say you take the focus away from the older, more traditional East Coast, trading to the Baltic, trading to Europe, and you look at where we're from, which is Glasgow. Overseas trade from Glasgow is an excellent example of this vitality of the pre-Union economy. Glasgow merchants traded illegally with the British West Indies. That was because the English Parliament wouldn't let them, right? So it's illegal in that sense. So they traded with British West Indies, and they traded with the American colonies, where they had friends or relatives, and the English Parliament had shut them out of what they called their trade, and then later their empire. But there was a ready market for coarse Scottish goods in the colonies because they're a lot cheaper, and the passage there was faster than coming all the way from the Thames, from London all the way around. So you're just like already on the west coast of Scotland. So it's a faster passage. The freight rates that the Scots charged and the insurance rates were lower as well. So anything that you could move out of Glasgow was going to be cheaper. And of course, our customs and excise system was pretty lax about what was going out and what we charge it, and what was coming in and what we would charge it. So there were Scots traders at places, sunny places like St. Kitts and Montserrat, places people go on their holidays now, Antigua in the 1680s, and in Philadelphia and Maryland by the 1690s. And that's what I was saying about Edward Randolph, panicking because there's so many of these guys all over the place. So this trade had actually started in the Cromwellian period, when some Scots had been sent to the colonies because they were rebels. And then during the Restoration, more people went over, so the numbers had increased. And then from the 1660s on, a number of businesses that were set up in Scotland and Glasgow in particular depended on sugar from the colonies because they needed it for their rum distilleries. And so the Scots were heavily involved in that, and they're also heavily involved in the tobacco trade. They used Newfoundland as a little clearinghouse, which is quite interesting. So from 1689 to 1707, the estimates of the annual imports of tobacco comes to something like £1.5 million. So that's coming in with duty paid, and then about another £250,000 without duty paid. And it's quite funny because what they would do is they would bring this stuff from Virginia, they would get it up to, because lots of Scots merchants. In fact, Tom Devine wrote a book called The Tobacco Lords, because the fanciest part of Glasgow is where the tobacco lords had their houses. They're absolutely gorgeous. So, so they would bring the tobacco up the coast to Newfoundland, and then they would trade maybe a little bit of it, and then they would plonk herring or whatever fish they have up there, cod, I don't know. They'd plonk fish on top of it, bring it into Glasgow, and then say, well, it's a hogshead of cod, 250 pounds of cod, and you paid a really low tax on that, and all you had to do was lift off the 5 cod at the top, and you had a hogshead of tobacco. You brought it in, you hadn't paid the proper excise. You know how much governments make off tobacco these days as well, so the same kind of idea. So the Scots centre of power in the colonies was in East New Jersey, Bruce Springsteen territory. And it was, as I said, it was really difficult, if not impossible, for the Surveyor General, this Edward Randolph, to get a conviction because there were so many Scots there, they would let them off. So the English started to tighten up the rules, and as soon as they tightened up the rules, the Scots Parliament started handing out even more licenses for people to go. So there's this, by the 1690s, there's this big problem where the English Parliament is saying, you can't do that because this is going to impact, you know, our bottom line. And the Scots Parliament's like, who do you think you are? We're just going to do it. And at that point, it's kind of, it looks like it's kind of okay, but when there's a changing king, that becomes a problem, because if the king ever sides with one over the other, then you've got trouble, because you don't have a united parliament, which is, you know, what the Act of 1707 is going to do. So when the Scots Parliament handed out licenses for trade in the colonies, which it's not really supposed to do, so it's acting really independently, and it can do that because the king's not really all that bothered with it at the time, right? So when they do that, the English Parliament annexes, the English annex all of the East Coast land not yet appropriated, and then prohibited the sale of land to anyone that wasn't a natural born subject of England, Wales or Ireland. So now the Scots couldn't buy land there, right? It's just like crazy. And then in another act said that in cases where the Scots were to be tried, only English, Irish or plantation born men could sit on the juries. So you have this kind of crisis bubbling up, and all through the 1680s and 1690s, the Scots merchants and you know, partly the Scots Parliament kept saying, you know, we'd like to have a big company like you've got. You've got the East India Company, you've got the Royal African Company, you've got Oliphant Company, all these monopoly companies, joint stock companies. We'd like one of those, and you know, the kings just aren't interested at all. And so that's going to become an issue, because the Scots want to have a company, and they call it the Company of Scotland, trading to Africa and the Indies, and this is just going to bring, you know, everything to a head, because the Hudson Bay Company is going to go, well, you can't just give them, they can go anywhere, they're not taxed, no, you can't do that. And of course, in those big English companies, Hudson Bay Company directors, many of them either were in the Commons or the House of Lords, so they're able to make political decisions, while, you know, we don't kind of like that these days, right? When you're a politician, you have to put your stuff into a blind trust and you're not allowed to profit from it. But those days it's perfectly okay. You're like, you're good at business, would you like to be a politician as well, you know? So all these things are happening, but I think the important thing is to just realize that the Scottish economy has definitely that blip with the 7 ill years, but it's something that's affecting all of Northern Europe. But by that, there's lots of stuff going on, and it may well be that there's too much stuff going on, that the Scottish Parliament is acting as though it runs the Scottish country, and the English Parliament saying to its king, and we're going to see there's a change, this is going to be the period where you don't kill the king, you just get rid of him and replace him with somebody else. You're going to say to him, they can't do that, you know, you got to stop them somehow, and this is going to make the Scots say, I don't know if we want the same king as them. You know, maybe the next time we're up for another king, maybe we'll just pick somebody else. And then the English are like, yeah, okay, that's it. That's it. So that's, you know, we're coming close now.
Right. So what's the real problem then in 1685?
Well, the real problem in 1685 is succession. You know, Charles, I mentioned, had these 13 illegitimate children, but no heir. And the English Parliament actually says to him, why don't you divorce your wife, because she's, you know, Catherine of Braganza. She comes with, you know, as usual, lots of money. She brings, I think, Bombay with her, the port of Tangiers, some rights in the Americas, you know, so like... So it says really good marriage, but they don't have any children. And he actually seems to be really attached to her. And they say to him, you know, divorce her. And he kind of goes, well, no, I'm not going to divorce her. And then they say to him, send her to Virginia for 7 years, and then we'll pretend that she's deserted you, and then you can have another wife and have some more kids. God, there's no problem with you, buddy, with your 13 kids, you're doing fine. And he says no. Now, one of the things that's going on in the background that nobody really knows about is that, you know, he's of course Protestant, right? He's Protestant. But during the Civil War, where is he? He's in France with his mom and his sisters and his wee brother James, and they're at the court of the French king. And his mother is Catholic anyway, and it looks as though he may have been tempted to become a Catholic. Never tells a soul, you know, nobody knows. And when they're in France, his younger brother James says, I'm a Roman Catholic, I'm a Catholic, and everybody's like, whoa, oh, okay then, but that's fine because you'll never be king, because Charles is obviously going to have lots of kids and that'll be fine. So it looks as though the problem is that he doesn't want to divorce her. He seems, yeah, I mean, he obviously really likes her, but he doesn't want to divorce her, maybe because he's Catholic and you can't get a divorce, and that's what kicks off the whole Henry VIII thing, you know, because when it comes to, when he's on his deathbed, he calls for the Catholic priest and then the Bishop of London. So it may well have been that he's Catholic, and that's really interesting as well, because when it becomes clear, when he says, look, my brother James is going to succeed me, everybody's like, oh my God, no, a Catholic. And he says, I'll guarantee that nothing will change. Nothing's going to change at all. He will run this country as I've run it. Well, he's a closet Catholic, so that, you know, that kind of gives it a kind of different, air. But you know, everybody's kind of uneasy about James, and it's very interesting because there's actually a couple of assassination attempts against both Charles and James. And there's a thing called the exclusionist crisis. So Charles is doing, you know, fine. He's called the Merry Monarch. I think it's a Robert Downey film, and you know, he plays Charles II in it. So that's fine. But remember I mentioned that the first of his sons, the Duke of Monmouth, so he's a grown-up now, and he has a lot of, you know, supporters, people that, you know, like in those Blackadder movies, like, oh, you're going to be king, and they all become friends with him. And so he says to Parliament, well, he says to all sorts of people, and then it goes to Parliament, why don't we exclude James from the succession, and I'll be the next king. And Charles says to him, you can't, son, because you're illegitimate. And he says that doesn't matter. So it actually goes through the House of Commons. Charles has to send the Parliament home. So this is called the exclusionist crisis, and while it's happening, James is up in Scotland at one point, and there's a fight again, you know, with the Protestants, and it's called affectionately the Killing Times. And so they have to get James out of there, so they boot him off to the continent for a while, kind of out of sight, out of mind. And so you have the assassination attempts and the exclusionist crisis, and this guy, the Duke of Monmouth, and his backers trying to push a bill through Parliament a few times to exclude James and to make him the king. And in the end, you know, Charles obviously blocks it. And in the end, Charles says to him, you were behind that assassination attempt on me and my brother, right? They really loved horses. They were going to Newmarket to watch the horse racing. And something happened. I don't know if it was they left something, but they turned back, and so the assassins missed them. So Charles says to, you know, his son, the Duke of Monmouth, you were behind that, weren't you? And he goes, yeah, I was. And so I think Charles got him to sign something or just admit it, and then the guy changed his mind and said to everybody in public, oh, I wasn't behind it. And Charles was so angry. It's the only time he kind of said, right, that's it, I don't want to have anything to do with you again, you know, stay away from court. So it looks as though Charles, every time Charles fell sick, everybody would like go, oh, it's okay, we'll have James, that's fine, you know, we're not bothered. And then Charles dies, looks like he had a stroke, dies in 1685, and James comes to the throne without really any problems at all. And the reason that there's probably not an issue at first is that when he was younger, he had got Anne Hyde, who was the daughter of like the Chancellor of England. He got her pregnant, and although she was a commoner, and Charles, you know, James was kind of like, well, I got her pregnant, but she's, you know, she's not like royal. Charles is really honourable, and he said to him, you've got to marry her, and he's like, but she's a Protestant, and she's a commoner. And Charles is like, I don't care, you know, do your duty, marry her. So with Anne Hyde, he has 2 daughters, Mary and Anne, and they're both brought up as Protestants. So everybody's kind of like, well, it's okay, you know, James is going to be king. Charles has already promised nothing will change, so everything will be fine. You know, maybe he won't live all that long. How much damage can you do? And then Mary will come to the throne, and then after her, Anne will come to the throne, and they're both Protestants. So, you know, we're a bit uneasy, but you know, we can see a kind of light at the end of the tunnel. It's going to be okay. And they're married to Protestants as well. You know, royal girls are always married off for diplomatic reasons. So at one point, Charles wanted to be friends with the stadtholder of Orange, so he married Mary. I think she's like 15, and she's like bawling her head off and crying. She doesn't want to leave, and Charles is like, right, you know, marry William of Orange. That's all there is to it. Off you go. And then she becomes really devoted to him. So she's married to like the most hardcore Protestant in, you know, the old Netherlands. They're not wearing the orange tracksuits on the church-based skating rink for nothing, the House of Orange. So, so she's married to this guy, really hardcore Protestant, that's fine. Anne's married off to, I think, Frederick, Prince of Denmark, also Protestant, so that's fine. So everybody's like, well, that's okay, they'll just come back. There are 2 Protestant families, they'll come back and they'll rule the country, and that will be, you know, no issue at all. But Anne Hyde is already dead, and so he remarries, and he remarries this young woman, Mary of Modena, who's like 4 or 5 years older than Anne, you know, so they're kind of all playmates together, like, oh, that's so much fun. But she's Catholic, and what happens? They have a son. And boys take precedence over girls. So that means that the next king of England is going to be another Catholic. And that's just, you know, a bridge too far. They were like, no! And so, you know, a boy trumped a girl. And it wasn't actually until this last year, that the British Parliament said that if William and Kate had a girl, that she would be next in line for the throne, right after her father, and that if a boy was born after that, he would, you know, like kind of leapfrog over her, like Anne and Charles. So that was a modern change to that rule. But you know, so you've got a king who's openly Catholic and says that he's not going to be annoying, but now he has a Catholic son. And Anne seems, there's a wonderful book called Ungrateful Daughters that talks about Anne and Mary, and Anne seems to have started, or at least helped spread, this rumor that Mary of Modena didn't really have the king's baby, and it wasn't really a boy, that it was a serving maid, and they put it in the kind of, you know, their equivalent of a hot water bottle, which is like a long handle, like a wee pan, put the baby in that, shoved it in the bed so he could have a male heir. And so she kind of tells her sister Mary, oh yeah, you know, it's all just a big trick. So there's all of this called the bedpan warming scheme. So there's all these kind of rumors circulating, and the interesting long-term effect of that is that when James is actually in exile, whenever any of the Stuart queens have a baby after that, it's always in public. It's always like 150 courtiers there to make sure that the baby's actually coming out of her body and not out of a hot water bottle, a stone hot water bottle, a rubber hot water bottle. So now this is again, it's this succession thing, and the elite call on Mary and say to Mary, will you come back? You know, they're a bit worried about your dad. Will you come back? And she says, I won't come back unless William comes as king. And he says, I won't come tied to my wife's apron strings. And so they offer Mary and William the monarchy, and then the big thing is, how do you get rid of James? Because he's still king. How are you going to get rid of him? So their preference is that he'll abdicate and save everybody some trouble, and of course he doesn't want to do that. So yeah, so you're coming closer and closer.
Once again, a cliffhanger.
Oh, I know, absolutely.
Don't go and look on Wikipedia to see how it ends. Come back for the third part of this discussion of the active.
Before the night falls.
Yeah.
Before the night falls. Yeah.
Okay, we'll see you next time.